She was 24 years old, and her family had, in the quiet and bloodless way of legal documents, disowned her. She had nothing to her name but a worn leather satchel, a small hammer, and $87 in folded bills. With that money, she bought a worthless patch of alkali flat outside Pioche, Nevada, and the broken-down stagecoach that sat rusting upon it. The townsfolk called her a fool for keeping the old wreck. But what nobody knew was that behind a false wall in the coach's rear boot was a secret that would not only save her, but change the course of the whole territory. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, because this is the story of Mabel Quinn. Mabel's life had been shaped by the scent of coal smoke and the ring of steel on steel. Her father, Alistair Quinn, was a blacksmith, a man whose quiet competence was known from Elko to Carson City. He was not a farrier who simply shod horses, but a master of his craft, who could forge anything from a delicate gate hinge to the heavy, complex ironwork that braced the undercarriages of the great Concord stagecoaches. Mabel had been his shadow from the time she could walk, her small hands learning the feel of different metals, the heft of different tools. He had taught her the language of the forge, how to read the color of the heat, from the shy cherry red to the brilliant white yellow of welding temperature, and how to listen for the solid thud of a perfectly set rivet. While other girls were learning needlepoint, Mabel was learning how to temper steel and how to true a wheel. Her father never treated her skills as a novelty. He treated them as her birthright. "Some folks have a mind for numbers, Mabel," he would say, his voice a low rumble beneath the hiss of the slack tub. "Some have a mind for words. You have a mind for how things fit together. That's a rare and honest thing." He gave her a gift on her 12th birthday, a small ball-peen hammer with a head he had forged himself and a hickory handle he had shaped to fit her grip perfectly. It was balanced and beautiful, a tool made with love, and it became her most treasured possession. He also taught her the business side of his work, showing her the ledgers where he recorded his contracts with the stage lines, the manifests of parts ordered and delivered, and the careful accounting of his earnings. She learned the flow of money and materials, the importance of a signed receipt, and the weight of a man's word recorded in ink. Her father's world was one of tangible things, of work done well and promises kept, and it was the only world she truly trusted. But when she was 17, a fever took Alistair in less than a week, leaving a silence in the smithy that no fire could ever fill. Her mother, a gentle and fragile woman, was adrift. Within a year, she married a local merchant named Silas Croft, a man whose assets were all on paper and whose heart held no room for the memory of a blacksmith or his soot-stained daughter. Silas saw Mabel not as a stepdaughter, but as a relic of a life he wished to erase, a physical reminder of a working man's world he considered beneath him. He tolerated her presence with a cool disdain, his thin smiles never reaching his eyes. For 7 years, Mabel lived in the shadow of her own home, the forge growing cold and her father's tools gathering a fine layer of dust. She kept to herself, holding on to the memory of her father's workshop and the solid, reassuring weight of the small hammer in her satchel. The end came not with a shout, but with the dry rustle of paper. 3 months after her mother passed away from a lingering illness, Silas Croft called Mabel into the parlor, the one room in the house she had always avoided. It was filled with his polished furniture and smelled of lemon oil and stale cigar smoke. He did not ask her to sit. He stood by the mantelpiece, a place of honor where a portrait of his own family now hung, and he held a sheaf of documents in his hand. "Mabel," he began, his voice devoid of any emotion, "your mother's estate has been settled. As you know, this house and the smithy were in her name, and now they are in mine." He gestured vaguely with the papers. "I have accepted an offer from a consortium in Carson City. They intend to tear down the forge and build a new mercantile." There was no hint of regret in his tone, only the flat finality of a business transaction concluded. He watched her face for a reaction, but Mabel had learned long ago not to show men like Silas what she was feeling. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. She felt a cold hollowness spread through her chest, the loss of her father's forge a physical ache, a second death. It was the last piece of him, the place where his presence still lingered in the scent of old coal and the worn handle of the trip hammer. She had always imagined one day reigniting the fire, hearing the bellows breathe again. That dream now turned to ash. Silas seemed disappointed by her composure. He cleared his throat and continued. "Legally, you have no claim. However," he said, drawing out the word as if bestowing a great kindness, "I have decided to provide you with a small stipend to begin a new life. It is more than you are owed." He stepped forward and held out a thin envelope. Inside, she would find $87. He also handed her a folded document. It was a copy of the deed of sale, his name and the names of the buyers stark and clear in precise script. It was a notice of eviction, a legal severing. "You have until the end of the week to gather your personal effects," he said, his duty done. He turned back to the mantelpiece, dismissing her. Mabel did not argue. She did not plead or weep. The time for tears had passed with her mother. She simply gave a slight, formal nod. She walked up to her small room, the floorboards silent beneath her feet. She packed her few clothes into a worn leather satchel. She took the small, perfect ball-peen hammer her father had made her and wrapped it in a woolen scarf, placing it carefully at the bottom. She did not take anything that belonged to her mother's life with Silas. She did not take a single thing from the house that was no longer hers. She was finished there. The next morning, long before the sun rose, she walked out the front door, closing it softly behind her. She did not look back at the dark shape of the smithy, a tombstone against the dawn sky. She walked to the freight office at the edge of town, the $87 a small, cold weight in her pocket. The journey east was a slow, grinding passage from one life to the next. Mabel paid a freight hauler named Gus for a spot on his wagon, a hard plank of wood tucked between barrels of salted fish and crates of mining equipment. The wagon moved at the plodding pace of 6 tired mules, their hides coated in a permanent layer of dust. For 10 days, the world was reduced to the squeal of ungreased axles, the rhythmic creak of leather harnesses, and the constant, gritty taste of the Nevada desert in her mouth. The landscape was a study in shades of brown and gray, vast plains of sagebrush and alkali stretching to distant, sun-blasted mountains that shimmered violet in the heat. Dust got into everything: her clothes, her hair, the pages of the cheap novel she had bought to pass the time. At night, the temperature plummeted, and she would huddle in her thin blanket, the immense, star-filled sky a cold and indifferent canopy. She watched the other passengers, prospectors with wild hope in their eyes, and a family heading to a new homestead, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. She spoke little, offering only polite, brief answers when addressed. Her silence was a shield, a way of holding the shattered pieces of her old life together. Gus, the freighter, was a man of few words himself, and he seemed to respect her reserve. He'd occasionally pass her a piece of jerky or an apple without a word, a small, rough kindness that she accepted with a grateful nod. She had bought her parcel of land from a notice pinned to the wall of the freight office, sight unseen. The description was stark. 1 acre, level ground, 5 miles west of Pioche, includes abandoned coach. The price was $80. It had seemed like a sign, a strange echo of her father's work. Now, under the relentless sun, the decision felt like a fool's gamble. She knew nothing of Pioche except that it was a silver boomtown, a place of raw energy and rough men. As they drew closer, the signs of mining were everywhere. Tailings piles like pale, man-made hills, the distant thump of stamp mills, and the scarred earth pocked with countless small claims. When Gus finally pulled the wagon to a halt at a fork in the dusty road, he pointed with his whip. "That'll be your plot there," he said. "Just past that rise." Mabel looked. There was nothing. Just a flat expanse of cracked earth, shimmering in the midday heat, dotted with sparse, hardy greasewood. And in the middle of it, listing to one side like a beached and broken whale, was the stagecoach. It looked smaller and more pathetic than she had imagined. Gus helped her down and unloaded her satchel. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked, a flicker of concern in his weathered face. "It's a hard place." Mabel looked from the desolate land to the derelict coach, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than grief stirred in her. It was a challenge. "I'm sure," she said, her voice steady. He nodded, tipped his hat, and with a cluck to his mules, the wagon rumbled on, leaving her alone in a cloud of settling dust, the silence of the desert descending around her. The stagecoach was a ghost of its former glory. It was a Concord. She could tell that immediately by the distinctive egg-shaped body and the thoroughbraces, the thick leather straps that formed its suspension system. Her father had worked on dozens of them, and she knew their construction as well as she knew her own hands. This one had been painted a deep, lustrous red once, but the Nevada sun had bleached it to a pale, peeling rose, with patches of bare wood showing through like bones. The name of the line, Wells, Fargo and Company, was just a faint ghost in faded gold leaf on the doors. It listed heavily to the left, the rear wheel on that side having collapsed into a wreck of splintered spokes and a warped iron tire. The other three wheels were intact but weathered, the wood dry and cracked. The driver's box was exposed to the elements. The leather of the seat split and curling, and the heavy brake lever was rusted into its bracket. Mabel walked around it slowly, her hand trailing over the rough, sun-baked panels. She ran her fingers over the iron fittings, the hinges and the braces. They were pitted with rust, but still solid, forged with a skill her father would have respected. The main body was built of seasoned ash and oak, and though the paint was gone, the wood itself seemed sound, a testament to the builders in Concord, New Hampshire, who had sent their creations on the long journey around the Cape Horn to serve the West. She pulled open one of the heavy doors, its hinges groaning in protest. The inside smelled of dust, decay, and the faint, musty scent of mice. The three bench seats were covered in what had once been fine leather, but it was now shredded and torn, the horsehair stuffing spilling out in clumps. The ceiling was stained with water spots, and a fine layer of sand covered every surface. It was a ruin. Anyone else would have seen it as firewood, as scrap. But Mabel saw the frame. She saw the honest joinery, the strength of the undercarriage, the enduring quality of the ironwork. She climbed up into the driver's seat, her hands resting where 100 other hands had held the reins. From here she could see her entire property, a square of pale, hard-packed earth under a vast, empty sky. This was it. This was home. In the back, the rear boot, designed for mail and luggage, was latched shut. She had to use the claw of her father's hammer to pry the rusted mechanism open. It swung down with a shuddering crash. The space was empty, save for a thick carpet of dust, cobwebs, and the desiccated husks of ancient insects. It was just a hollow wooden box. For the next several days, she made her camp against the sheltered side of the coach, using a canvas tarp she'd bought in Pioche to create a lean-to. She spent her last $7 on flour, beans, bacon, and a small cast-iron skillet. The coach was not just a landmark on her property. It was her only shelter, her only possession of any substance. It was a broken thing on a barren piece of land, but it was hers. And as she began the slow, difficult work of making a life in that unforgiving place, she found herself returning to the coach again and again, not just for shelter, but for the strange sense of connection it gave her to the father she had lost. Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of Mabel's life became simple and stark. wake with the sun, tend to her small fire, eat a meager breakfast, and work. She spent her days clearing the larger rocks from her land and trying to coax a small garden from the reluctant soil, hauling water in 2 buckets from a creek a mile away. The work was hard, her hands growing calloused and her back aching with a constant dull pain. In the evenings, she would sit in the doorway of the stagecoach, mending her clothes or simply watching the sky bleed from orange to purple over the mountains. The coach became the center of her world. It was her pantry, her closet, her one solid wall against the relentless wind. One afternoon, seeking refuge from a sudden dust storm, she decided to properly clean out the rear boot, intending to make it a more secure place to store her dwindling food supplies. She swept out the layers of dirt and debris, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from the open hatch. She began tapping on the wooden interior panels, checking for rot or insect damage. Her knuckles rapped against the side walls, a solid, resonant thud. Then she tapped the front wall, the one that backed up against the passenger cabin. Thud, thud, thud. And then, near the bottom on the right side, the sound changed. It wasn't the dull sound of wood, but a tight, hollow echo. Talk. She frowned and tapped it again. Talk. It was distinctly different. Her heart gave a small, quick beat. She ran her fingers over the paneling, searching for a seam, a latch, a hidden button. There was nothing. The wood was smooth, covered in the same ancient dust as the rest. She retrieved her father's hammer from her satchel. Using the flat face, she tapped gently along the area. The hollow sound was confined to a section about 2 feet wide and a foot high. It was a deliberate space. Taking a deep breath, she flipped the hammer and inserted the sharp edge of the claw into the hairline crack between the panel and the floor. She pried gently. The old wood groaned, but it held fast. It wasn't rot. It was expertly joined. This was no accident. With more force, she leveraged the claw. There was a sharp crack as a hidden wooden peg snapped, and the panel shifted. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled. An entire section of the wall, fitted with astonishing precision, came away in her hands. Behind it was not the outer wall of the passenger cabin, but a dark, empty space. And in that space, nestled securely, sat a small, heavy strongbox bound with straps of black iron. It was not locked with a key, but sealed with a heavy, intricate latch. It took her 10 minutes of careful work with her hammer and a piece of scrap metal she used as a chisel to force the mechanism. With a final, groaning click, the lid sprang open. The setting sun cast a golden light into the box, illuminating its contents. It was filled to the brim with stacks of United States banknotes, bundled neatly with twine, and resting on top of the money was a slim, leather-bound book, a passenger manifest. Mabel's hands trembled as she lifted the manifest from the strongbox. The leather was dry but supple, the kind used for ledgers of importance. The words, Overland Stage Line, Virginia City Division, were embossed in faded gold on the cover. She opened it. The first page was a handwritten note, the script neat and deliberate. The ink faded to a rusty brown. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It read, To whoever finds this. My name is Isaac Reed. I drove the stage for this line for 17 years. What is in this box is my life's savings, $4,000. But the manifest is the more important thing. On June 12, 1867, I carried the men listed herein from the Carson River Basin. They were not passengers. They were murderers. We passed the smoldering remains of a Paiute camp. They boasted of it. Women, children, no one was spared. One of the men is now a respected figure in the territory, a man on his way to Washington. His name is Senator Julian Croft. I was paid for my silence and my service that day, a sum I never spent. I could not go to the law. They are his law. So I hide this here, in the last coach I ever drove before I quit the line. The money is for you, a reward for finding it. Use it to build a good life. The manifest is for the truth. What you do with it is your burden now. Godspeed. I.R. Mabel sank back on her heels, the manifest held loosely in her hands. Julian Croft. She knew the name. A powerful state senator, a man whose name was often in the territorial newspapers, praised for his vision and leadership, and Silas Croft's cousin. The connection struck her like a physical blow. The man who had cast her out was kin to the man named in this book. She slowly turned the pages of the manifest. There were the names, 5 of them, listed clearly beside Senator Croft's. The date, the route, the coach number, all meticulously recorded in Isaac Reed's steady hand. This wasn't just a record. It was an indictment, a voice from the grave speaking a terrible truth. She looked at the money in the box. $4,000. It was a staggering sum, a fortune that could change everything. It was enough to buy a proper house, to leave this desolate patch of earth behind forever. She could disappear, start over somewhere no one knew her name, or she could stay. She could use this money, this legacy from a stranger, to build the life she had been denied. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose door of the coach, but inside the cramped, dark space of the boot, the world had gone still. She looked from the money to the manifest, from Isaac Reed's savings to his testimony. He had left her not just wealth, but a choice, a profound and heavy responsibility. She carefully closed the manifest, its terrible secret now hers to keep. She placed it back in the strongbox, on top of the money, and closed the heavy lid. For now, the secret would stay hidden. The first step was not revenge or justice. The first step was to build. With a new sense of purpose, a fire lit in the cold hollowness of her chest. She fitted the false panel back into its place, the secret once more disappearing behind a wall of wood. The first thing Mabel did was not spend the money. She hid it. She dug a deep hole beneath the floorboards of the coach's main cabin, lined it with flat stones, and placed the strongbox inside, covering it with dirt and replacing the boards so no one would ever know. The knowledge of it was enough. It was a foundation, unseen but solid, upon which she could now build. Her first real task was the broken wheel. It was beyond simple repair. It needed to be completely rebuilt. She knew the principles, the way the dished shape gave it strength, the precise angles of the mortises in the hub, but she lacked the heavy tools and the seasoned wood. She walked the 5 miles into Pioche, a town teeming with the chaotic energy of the silver boom. She found the wheelwright's shop tucked away on a side street, the air around it smelling of sawdust and hot iron. The man inside was named Elias Vance, a man well into his 70s, with hands as gnarled as old oak roots. He looked at her skeptically when she described what she needed. "That old wreck out on the flat?" he grunted. "That's firewood, girl, not a carriage." Mabel didn't flinch. "The hub is sound," she said, her voice even. "And the iron tire is salvageable. I need seasoned hickory for 12 spokes and 4 new felloes of white oak. I can pay for the wood and for your time." Elias fell silent, surprised by her specific terminology. He looked at her more closely, at her work-roughened hands and the steady confidence in her eyes. He saw not a foolish girl, but someone who understood the craft. "Hickories, dear," he said, testing her. "And I don't have time for fancies." "I know what it's worth," Mabel replied, and she quoted him a fair price for the raw materials, a price she knew from her father's old ledgers. A slow smile cracked the old man's weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Alistair Quinn's girl. I heard you'd left town." He had known her father, had respected his work. That was the only reference she needed. He agreed to help her, not by doing the work for her, but by allowing her the use of his shop and his tools, guiding her when she needed it. For 2 weeks, Mabel worked in his shop, her father's hammer feeling perfectly at home in her hand as she shaped and fitted the new spokes. She learned the rhythms of pioche. A woman named Martha Gable, who ran the boarding house next door, began bringing her a hot meal in the middle of the day, a thick stew or a plate of beans and bread, never saying much more than, "You need to keep your strength up." A freight driver named Tom Olson, who remembered her from the wagon, saw her struggling to find good, seasoned oak for the felloes, the curved sections of the wheel's rim. A week later, he arrived with 4 perfect pieces he had sourced from a supplier in Utah, refusing any payment beyond a simple thank you. The community began to notice her, not with pity, but with a quiet respect. They saw her dedication, the skill in her hands. They stopped calling her the fool on the flat. They started calling her Mabel. When the wheel was finally finished, true and strong, Elias helped her transport it back to her land. Together, using a system of levers and jacks, they raised the heavy coach and fitted the new wheel onto the axle. When it was done, the coach stood level and proud for the first time in years. It was no longer a wreck. It was a restoration. With the coach now standing square on its 4 wheels, it transformed from a piece of wreckage into a proper structure. It was the anchor of her homestead, a symbol of her persistence. Mabel's next project was to build a life around it. She used a small portion of Isaac Reed's money, exchanging the old banknotes for new currency in careful, small transactions at different banks in nearby towns to avoid suspicion. With it, she bought quality lumber, glass for 2 windows, and a small cast-iron stove. She did not build a separate cabin. Instead, she built her home directly onto the side of the coach, incorporating it into the design. The coach's solid, windowless right side became the back wall of her single-room cabin. Its roof extended over the driver's box, creating a sheltered porch. The coach was no longer just next to her home. It was part of it. The men who delivered the lumber were surprised by her detailed plans, the precise measurements she had drawn on a piece of scrap paper. They saw she was not just building a shack, but a proper dwelling. Elias Vance, who had become a frequent visitor, taught her how to frame the walls and set the rafters. He admired how she used her father's smithing knowledge to forge her own hinges and latches for the door and windows, her small hammer tapping out a steady, purposeful rhythm. Martha Gable would often walk out from town with her 2 young daughters, bringing a basket with fresh-baked bread, eggs, or a jar of preserves. She would sit on an overturned crate and talk to Mabel while she worked, her presence a quiet thread of companionship weaving itself into the solitary landscape. The coach itself became her next focus. She spent weeks carefully scraping away the old, flaking paint, sanding the weathered wood panels until they were smooth and pale. She did not repaint it in the original garish red. Instead, she treated it with linseed oil, rubbing it deep into the grain until the ash and oak glowed with a warm, golden luster that seemed to capture the light of the desert sun. She cleaned and repaired the interior, patching the leather seats with new material she bought in town and stuffing them with fresh horsehair. It was no longer a functional vehicle meant for travel, but a beautiful, preserved room, a quiet space for reflection. Travelers on the road to Pioche began to notice the transformation. The wreck on the Alkali Flat had become a unique and handsome homestead. Mabel's coach, they started calling it. It became a landmark. Freighters would use it as a marker. 2 miles past Mabel's coach, you'll find the turnoff. She was no longer an outsider. Her name was now part of the landscape, her home a point of reference. She never spoke of the money or the manifest hidden beneath the floorboards. Her prosperity was quiet, evident only in the quality of her tools, the soundness of her home, and the small, well-tended garden that now bloomed with surprising life against the cabin wall. She was building the good life Isaac Reed had wished for her, nail by nail, board by board. The final piece of the restoration was an act of quiet ceremony. Mabel took the slim leather manifest from its hiding place in the strongbox. The paper was fragile, the ink a testament to a history that only she and a dead man knew. The weight of it felt different now. Not just a burden, but a trust. She could have used it. She could have sent it to a newspaper in San Francisco or Washington, exposed Senator Croft, and brought a pillar of the territory crashing down. She had thought about it many nights. The power she held a hot coal in her mind. But she remembered the reason Isaac Reed had hidden it, rather than use it himself. The law was Croft's law. To release it into that world would be to lose control of it, to turn his act of witness into a political weapon that could easily be twisted or buried. Instead, she decided to honor the truth by preserving it. She took a portion of the softest new leather she had bought for the seats, and, with careful, practiced stitches, she sewed a simple, protective pouch for the manifest. It was an act of craft, of respect. She placed the pouch not back in the darkness beneath the floor, but inside the coach itself, on the seat behind the driver's box, a place of honor. It was there, a quiet, ever-present passenger. In the evenings, she would sometimes sit in the coach's restored interior, the door open to the cool desert air, and simply look at the pouch. It was a reminder that history is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet, handwritten list of names, waiting patiently. One cool autumn afternoon, a dusty buggy pulled up to her homestead. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, his face a mask of polite inquiry. It was Silas Croft. He looked at the cabin, at the beautifully restored coach, his eyes taking in the quiet prosperity of the place. He could not reconcile the destitute girl he had cast out with the competent woman standing before him. "Mabel," he said, his voice strained. "I was in Pioche on business. I heard you had settled here." He was fishing, trying to understand how she had accomplished this. "I have," she said, her voice calm and level. There was no anger in it, only a vast distance. He gestured at the coach. "It's remarkable. I never would have imagined." His eyes darted around, looking for the source of her fortune. A lucky mining claim, a wealthy husband he hadn't heard about. He could not comprehend that she had simply built it herself. She said nothing, letting his own assumptions fill the silence. He eventually mentioned his cousin, the senator, was considering an investment in the Pioche mines. He watched her face for a reaction. There was none. She was as still and unreadable as the desert stone. Her power, she realized, was not in revealing the secret, but in holding it. Her silence was its own form of justice. After a few more minutes of awkward pleasantries, Silas Croft climbed back into his buggy and departed, more unsettled and confused than when he had arrived. Mabel watched him go, a small speck of dust on the horizon, and felt not triumph, but a quiet, settled peace. She had not defeated him. She had simply outgrown him. Her world was no longer defined by his judgment or the loss he had inflicted upon her. Her world was here, built of wood and iron and her own two hands. The sun was setting, casting long, deep blue shadows from the distant mountains. Mabel Quinn sat on the driver's box of the old Concord coach, her hand resting on the worn wood of the seat beside her. The air was cool and smelled of dust and the faint, sweet scent of the desert primrose that grew near her doorstep. From this perch she could see the small, sturdy cabin she had built, a light glowing warmly in its window. She could see her garden, fenced and orderly, and the neat stack of firewood for the coming winter. Everything in her view was something she had made or mended. In her lap, she held the small ball-peen hammer her father had given her so many years ago. The hickory handle was smooth and dark with the oil from her own hands, a perfect extension of her arm. It was a tool of creation, a legacy of honest work. It had built this life. Inside the coach, resting on the back seat, was the leather pouch containing Isaac Reed's manifest. It was a tool of witness, a legacy of quiet truth. The two objects, one from her father who had loved her, and one from a stranger who had trusted her, had become the twin pillars of her existence. One represented the power to build, the other the power to remember. She thought of Silas Croft, his confusion and his veiled questions. He lived in a world of transactions, of profit and loss, of what could be taken from others. He would never understand that true value was not in what you could acquire, but in what you could restore. He had given her $87 to be rid of her, and with it, she had bought a home, a purpose, and a community. The people of Pioche no longer saw her as a fool. They saw her as a fixture, a part of the town's fabric. Elias Vance now sent apprentices to her to learn about ironwork. Martha Gable traded her vegetables for mending. Tom Olson stopped by on every run, just to share a cup of coffee and news from the road. She was not just surviving, she was belonging. The coach, once a symbol of abandonment, was now a monument to resilience. It was no longer a stagecoach, but it was still a vessel. It carried the story of a driver's conscience, the truth of a terrible secret, and the weight of a young woman's determination. Mabel Quinn was 24 when her family cast her out. She had $87 to her name, and she spent it on a worthless patch of land and the broken coach that sat upon it. It was the best $87 she had ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and quiet strength. If Mabel's journey resonated with you, please consider sharing it with someone who understands that the things we discard often hold the most value. We leave you with this thought. What forgotten thing in your own life, if given care and attention, might hold the key to building something new? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.